City. A crowd of people gathered in one of the huge shopping centers. Two girls got lost in it. One of them, a pretty brunette with wavy hair, was smiling and filming something on her brand new iPhone. Her friend, a blonde in a crumpled denim jacket, was indignant. And how much longer do we have to wait? And most importantly, for what? To look at some handbag? The dark-haired girl waved the girl away and said that she should be more patient. This is a special exhibition of designer items that will close this afternoon. It will be attended by Benjamin Lee himself, the legendary art director of Iju. This exhibition is dedicated to his farewell collection. He is retiring very soon. The dark-haired girl had heard that even some Hollywood stars would come to this event. The blonde sighed. She did not understand her friend's fascination with the world of fashion. Standing in line for hours to look at things you just can't afford is crazy. The dark-haired woman put her hand on the blonde's shoulder. "You don't understand anything," the brown-eyed one hissed. Millions of women from all over the world dream about the bag presented at the exhibition. Each of them would give anything to at least hold her in their hands. This bag is a novelty from the best Korean brand. The blonde, who was already tired of listening to all this, said that she understood everything. But the dark-haired woman was not going to let her friend go. She raised her head and froze. Standing on the steps of the escalator was a tall woman dressed in a white shirt and dark purple dress. The stranger was accompanied by several men in business suits. One of them, with joyful excitement in his voice, informed her that all the goods from the farewell collection were sold out in a matter of days. There were many who did not have time to buy one of the dream items. That is why the brand's website is currently overloaded with pre-orders. The woman raised an eyebrow. The stranger was unhappy. Designer items should be exclusive. If almost every student can buy a bag of a well-known brand, it will be no different from a mass market. A woman walked into a boutique, ignoring the admiring glances of people. She is not used to adoration. The dark-haired woman stopped in front of a display case with bags. Later, the manager of the store approached the stranger. They started discussing something. Meanwhile, a real mess was happening at the cash register. One girl asked the consultant to sell all the things that were on the stranger. The woman heard the girl scream but ignored it. All she allowed herself to do was smile smugly and tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. The stranger was pleasantly flattered that the young Korean women were almost praying for her. On Chu Do-in, the director of this store, the granddaughter of the founder of the Iju brand, Kim Yong-ju, the manager's voice pulled the woman out of her thoughts. He informed her that the company had a problem, and the founder of the brand wanted to see Chu in her office in 15 minutes, and the young woman could not obey her grandmother's order. So at the appointed time, Chu was already there. The dark-haired woman realized that the CEO was not in a good mood as soon as she entered the office. Chu cautiously approached her manager's desk. An older woman dressed in an elegant black dress and a dark gray shirt stood up and looked into her granddaughter's eyes. "Did you even think when you suggested that I consider the resumes of these people for the position of art director?" Kim threw a stack of papers off the table. Chu collected them with a calm expression. The young woman said that the selected candidates are highly qualified workers. If you cling to anything, the company may be left without an art director altogether. In this case, the share price will fall sharply. But it did not make any impression on the general director. She said she was not going to hire anyone from Chu's shortlist. According to the older woman, these people have not grown up to the level of the brand. The company needs someone creative, intelligent, and persistent. Someone who can maintain the glory of Iju for years. And Kim already knew such a person. The woman took out a magazine about the stars from her desk drawer and started flipping through it. After a moment, the CEO found the right page. It depicted a dark-haired man with light brown eyes. He was dressed simply but tastefully. Gray trousers, a swamp-colored tie, and a white shirt. The photo's caption said that this handsome guy is Ham Jong-woo, winner of the Marcus Naselli Design Award. Chu crossed her arms over her chest. She, like all people from the world of fashion, knew Ham. And the young woman was annoyed that her grandmother thought that she had not guessed to offer him a job at IG. Chu said she called Ham as soon as the art director position became available. But the man did not pick up the phone. The woman learned from her colleagues and designers of other companies that Kam went on vacation and turned off his phone. No one knows about his whereabouts. Kim frowned and her blue eyes flashed. The woman said in a firm tone that Chu should do a better job. Otherwise, the general director will have to find someone more ambitious and persistent. And there are a lot of such people. More than Chu can imagine. The dark-haired girl closed her eyes and sighed. She was used to her grandmother's scathing comments. They no longer scared the young woman, as it was in the first years of her work. The dark-haired woman understood that these were empty threats. Kim is unlikely to be able to attract someone more hardworking than her granddaughter to her company. Chu's evening was quite interesting. Immediately after the end of her workday, she went to the most expensive hotel in town to spend time with her lover, Ham Jong-woo. Yes, the dark-haired woman was in a relationship with the designer, and she carefully hid it from everyone, especially from your grandmother. Kim would hardly be happy if she found out that her granddaughter was doing something else besides work. And Chu's next scandal is unnecessary. The dark-haired girl kissed and hugged her lover when he told her that he was going to be the art director of Iju. "So we won't be separated even at work," the man whispered in the woman's ear. At that moment, Chu felt like the happiest person in the world. A week later, Hum and dark-haired met in the parking lot near one of the offices. The man apologized to his beloved for not being able to see her earlier as they agreed. Ham, not taking his eyes off his smartphone screen, said he had not arrived because all flights had been suspended. He asked if Chu was sad without him. The dark-haired woman, who was also busy with her own affairs, answered in an indifferent tone that everything was fine. She promised the dark-haired woman to book a new place for next Tuesday. The man smiled. "Great, then 3 days before the meeting, please send me the place and time." The dark-haired woman nodded her head and asked her husband to check if she had made a mistake when entering his information on the hotel's website. The dark-haired man got behind the wheel of his car. "You should remember everything about me by now, Chu. After all, very soon you will become my wife." The man flashed his eyes cheerfully. After a few minutes, the car started moving. Chu squinted and waved at Ham. As his black Audi pulled out of the parking lot, the dark-haired woman clenched her hand into a fist and joyfully shouted, "Hooray!" She took out a wedding ring from her dress pocket. She was going to propose to Ham next week, and he would have no reason to refuse. They have already discussed it. When Ham becomes Iju's art director, Kim will have to ease his pressure on the company's employees, particularly Chu. The dark-haired man simply will not allow a woman to treat his lover like that. Ham could also help the woman remove Kim from the position of CEO and take over the publishing house. A dreamy smile appeared on Chu's lips. "Miss Chu!" A hoarse voice tore the dark-haired man from his pleasant thoughts. The woman looked around and saw a hooded man. Part of the stranger's face was obscured by unruly brown hair. Chu already wanted to ask why this guy had a crush on her when he took off his hood. "You entertained me quite a bit. Perhaps detectives in our country are easy prey?" Chu froze in place. She had already seen this man and did not really want to meet him again. People began to gather near the dark-haired man. They whispered excitedly about Chu's personal life. Someone thought that the dark-haired woman had an affair with the detective. Someone, that she got into some kind of criminal story. Chu didn't know what to say to that. The dark-haired man touched his watch on his left wrist with his hand. "Take it away, I don't need your gifts." The man's tone was outrageous. The situation was getting out of control. Chu grabbed the man's hand and pulled him to her car. The woman did not want to discuss anything with him in front of the public. However, the dark-haired man had other plans for this. He released his palm from the woman's grip. Chu measured the man with a cold gaze. The dark-haired man lowered his head. He accused Chu of touching his body without permission and called director Ija the owner. The dark-haired woman froze at such words. Such behavior seemed too impudent to her. Who is this man to talk like that to the director of the most famous Korean clothing and accessories brand? Chu lightly slapped the dark-haired man on the arm, and with undisguised rage in her voice told him to explain normally what happened. The man immediately fell asleep. "Is it all because of that incident last week?" suggested the woman. The young man remained silent. It seems he didn't want to talk about it, or he was just afraid of the outburst of anger of the dark-haired woman. Last Tuesday, Chu, dressed in a pretty light pink dress, entered the banquet hall of the house rented for a few days. It was here that the woman was supposed to meet her lover. The dark-haired woman cast a critical glance around the table. Chu then turned to the waiter who approached her. The woman asked if everything was ready. He replied with a nervous smile that everything was just perfect. But the woman doubted the truth of his words, and not in vain. The dark-haired woman's gaze stopped at the bottle of wine. Not the wine she asked to buy for a romantic dinner. The waiter began to apologize to the dark-haired man. The woman did not react to it in any way. The man, stuttering, said that he would replace the wine in a few minutes. After that, the waiter hastened to leave the hall. He did not want to fall under the hot hand of the director of Aiju. When the door closed, the dark-haired woman sat down on the couch and took out her smartphone from her pocket. The woman took several selfies to post on her Instagram. Chu was not going to reveal who exactly she was waiting for. First of all, there should be intrigue in the lives of influential personalities. Second, no one should know about her relationship with Ham until he confesses to her. The dark-haired girl put the phone down, got up and walked over to the table. The woman was going to uncork the wine, which, by the way, was never replaced. Suddenly, her smartphone vibrated. Chu, not letting go of the bottle of wine, took the gadget in her hands. The dark-haired man was calling Ham. She smiled and picked up the phone. The woman asked her lover if he was already in Korea. But to Chu's surprise, the man replied that he was still in Thailand. The man said with regret in his voice that the weather was to blame. Due to the sudden rain, flights were canceled for the safety of pilots and passengers. Sorry, the man felt guilty. The dark-haired woman was disappointed. And that's putting it very mildly. The woman wanted to smash the phone against the wall, but the dark-haired woman understood that Ham would not appreciate such behavior, so she held back. But Chu lost her composure when she spilled wine on her new dress. The woman took the phone away from her ear and cursed quietly. The dark-haired woman wasn't sure that such a stain could be wiped off. The dark-haired man asked the woman if everything was okay with her. Chu hurriedly replied that she was just thinking. The man wished his passion a good rest and hung up. The woman smiled mockingly. What a good vacation can be here. A loved one from whom she expected to testify today will not be able to fly, and an expensive dress is stained with wine. The dark-haired woman mentally cursed Hama, although she understood that he was not to blame for anything. The woman was simply sorry for the wasted money, time and effort spent on cooking. For the last week, all her thoughts had been occupied by Ham's arrival. She wanted to please him so much that she even forgot to take any other clothes besides her best dress. The dark-haired girl went out into the corridor to look for some clean clothes. In such a large house, there must be something for such occasions. Chu's attention was drawn to the neatly folded form of the maid on the dresser. Meanwhile, in the main hall of the house, a man with warm light brown eyes and thick brown hair looked around enthusiastically and spoke on the phone. The man was telling his friend, who was in the hospital, about the beauty of the resort he was lucky enough to visit. A heavy sigh was heard on the other end of the receiver. The girl was sorry that she could not go with her friend due to problems with her appendix. The man smiled gently and said that they would have another chance to rest together. In addition, it is not her fault that it happened. If anyone should apologize, it's me. The dark-haired man took a few steps forward. I should have stayed and taken care of you. The dark-haired man was so busy talking on the phone that he didn't notice what was happening around him at all. A 9-year-old girl ran a few centimeters away from the man. Suddenly, the little girl caught on something and began to fall. Fortunately, the dark-haired man managed to catch her. The man's girlfriend suggested that he find a woman at the resort. He replied quite sharply that he had enough of crime novels. The girl, who was still held by the man with one hand, was frightened by his tone. She opened her eyes wide. The dark-haired man noticed this and, to calm the little one, smiled at her. Then the man put the child on the floor. The girl immediately ran to her mother, who could not find her daughter for several minutes. The man continued the conversation on the phone. He told his girlfriend that he no longer wanted a relationship. He doesn't need it anymore. Suddenly, the dark-haired man noticed a gentleman in a dark cap in the crowd and froze in place. Talk later. The man hastened to hang up the phone. He focused all his attention on the stranger. A faded suit, a thin long scar on her cheek. This is Pomtifa Paulson, a criminal who has been wanted for a long time. The dark-haired man could not believe that he met such a person at one of the most expensive and popular resorts in the country. The man assumed that it must be fate. I have to catch him, the dark-haired man said to himself. The man went in the same direction as Paulson. When the criminal turned into one of the corridors, the detective stopped. No matter how much the man wanted to catch up with Paulson and knock him to the floor, he knew that he shouldn't do that. A dark-haired person cannot endanger himself or others. Therefore, you need to act very carefully and quietly. The man was peering around the corner, waiting for Paulson to pass by. Suddenly, the dark-haired man heard someone's triumphant shout, "I caught this thief!" The man looked around and saw two women in the main hall, who almost fought among themselves. One of them, a blonde in a green dress, tried to snatch a purse from the hands of a dark-haired woman in the form of a maid. She tried with all her might to resist her attacker. The dark-haired girl did not let go of the strap of her bag for a moment. It was almost impossible to get the thing out of this woman's hands. The dark-haired girl told the blonde to calm down, so that she would not regret her actions later. But the attacker did not think to stop. Instead, she started screaming even louder, like it's her bag and there's proof of it. The blonde asked one of the guards to confirm this, but he was silent. It would seem that a moment later, and the attacker will be furious. The woman smiled mockingly, screamed, and did not stop trying to take the purse from the dark-haired woman. But in contrast to her dark-haired opponent, she behaved calmly. She pressed the bag to her and said in a firm voice, "This thing belongs to me, and I will not give it to you no matter what you prove here." Those present in the hall froze. They did not know what to say. The director of the Iju brand is suspected of theft, but this is a sensation. All newspapers with such headlines will sell out on the first day. Of course, Chu did not want such fame. The only way to prove that this bag belonged to her was to show the documents. The dark-haired woman started rummaging in her bag. The woman wanted to remove the serial number from it, next to which the details of the owner of the item were indicated. However, the dark-haired woman remembered that inside was her love letter to Ham. If someone finds out, a new scandal may break out, and it is not far from the release. Therefore, the dark-haired woman did not show anything to the guests and the organizers of the resort. There was silence in the hall. Chu suggested that the blonde deal with everything that happened in her room, but the blonde did not want to listen to the woman. She was convinced that Chu was a thief. The director of Iju was frantically thinking about what to do in such a case, when the blonde grabbed her by the hair and pulled her. Chu involuntarily screamed in pain and surprise. The dark-haired girl wanted to break free, but the attacker's grip was too strong. The people in the hall didn't even try to help Chu. They just stood and watched as the blonde pulled the director of a famous brand by her hair. One guy actually took out his phone from his jeans pocket and started filming everything that was happening. Chu noticed it. Fear flashed in the woman's eyes. The dark-haired woman imagined these loud headlines in all social networks and the press. If the director of Ija is exposed as a thief, her reputation, as well as the reputation of the brand, will be destroyed. The woman could not allow this. She began to shout loudly at everyone, at the blonde to finally get rid of her unfortunate hair, on the guy to hide the damn phone and help. But none of those present reacted to the dark-haired man. They did not want to stop the spectacle. When Chu realized that it was useless to ask anyone for help in this evil, she called the security. The dark-haired screamed loud enough to be heard even in the hallways. About a minute later, a male detective burst into the hall. He released Chu's hair as gently as possible. The blonde was furious. "Who dared?" she throated. The man was confused for a moment. Despite his specific work, he did not often see such angry women, especially when the reason for their anger was something like a purse. The man reached into the breast pocket of his shirt. He took out a plastic card. Police. This word had a magical effect on the blonde. She immediately calmed down and in an innocent voice began to tell the detective about Chu stealing her purse. The dark-haired man smiled and said that he was sure that the director of Iju was not involved in this matter. A thief would hardly carry a stolen thing in front of everyone. Chu simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all. Paulson approached the detective and the women from behind. The dark-haired man didn't know what the criminal was doing here now, but he decided to take the opportunity to catch him. The dark-haired man grabbed Paulson's arm. He pitifully began to ask to let him go. The detective turned to the security guard who ran somewhat late to the screams in the hall. The dark-haired man said to check Paulson's things. The security guard unfastened the thief's iron and saw the purse there, because of which the blonde almost killed Chu. People in the hall froze in place. They had no idea that this unremarkable man with a scar could be a criminal. The detective handcuffed Paulson. The blonde smiled guiltily at the director of Ij and apologized to her for the misunderstanding. The dark-haired one snorted. "And after what happened, she still has the audacity to apologize?" The detective asked security to take Paulson to the local station. When the criminal disappeared from the man's sight, he turned his attention to the disheveled Chu. The dark-haired one thought that it would be unfair to leave a man who had been pulled by the hair for nothing without compensation. Meanwhile, Chu took out a pencil from her purse and used it to make a circle on her head. This hairstyle looked pretty good. The dark-haired man scratched his neck. He tried to gather his thoughts to speak to Chu. The woman did not pay attention to the detective. Now the dark-haired girl was more interested in the guy who was filming her on the phone. Chu approached him and asked him to delete the video. When the young man refused to do this, the dark-haired woman grabbed the phone from his hands and deleted the video herself. The woman told the outraged man that he was still lucky. If he continued to refuse, she would have to go to court. The dark-haired woman turned her back to the boy. Chu was about to leave the hall when someone's hand handed her a bottle with some kind of drink. The dark-haired girl looked up. A smiling detective stood in front of her. He asked Chu if she was really scared by the whole purse situation. The man said not to worry. Everything worked out. The dark-haired woman was silent. She did not understand why this man was talking so sweetly to her and even offered to drink something. The woman glanced at the bottle. "Espresso!" exclaimed the dark-haired woman. Chu rarely used coffee in cans, but she saw such a drink in stores more than once. The man told the dark-haired woman that she could drink if she wanted. The detective also showed the woman his ID. From him, the dark-haired woman learned that the man's name was Gu Shi Yen. He put the coffee bottle in Chu's hand and flashed his eyes cheerfully. The man said that he worked in different parts of the country and saw many different people. "Situations like yours don't surprise me anymore, but I understand that you might have been scared." His voice was soft and soothing, and Chu liked it. The man leaned over to the dark-haired woman and whispered in her ear that although this hotel was luxurious, the guests in it were simply horrible people. The dark-haired woman smiled from the corner of her mouth. The woman has already forgotten when someone spoke to her in such an informal, friendly manner. Even her lover Ham was often formal in his speech. Chu opened the bottle, raised it to her lips, and took several small sips of coffee. The dark-haired one didn't really like the taste. "Too sweet," she said to Gu. The detective laughed. He didn't expect a woman like Chu to like cheap cold-bottled coffee. "Well, at least I tried to help you." Gu squinted. "I don't think you need to worry about any branded stuff." The detective pointed at Chu's purse. "They're all pretty much the same anyway, and they cost like an airplane wing." The dark-haired girl pursed her lips and gripped the strap of her bag with her hand. The woman was annoyed by the young man's words. What does he even know about clothes and fashion? Gu didn't seem to notice the change in his interlocutor's mood. He continued to talk about the uselessness of branded items. The last straw for Chu was the husband's words that fakes are better than the original. Like, he heard in the news that they are of better quality. The dark-haired woman crumpled the coffee bottle and tossed it aside. Then Gu finally realized that he had said something superfluous. Chu took out her phone from her purse and asked the man to dictate his number. The dark-haired man asked why this was necessary. The dark-haired woman gave a sinister smile and said that she wanted to thank the detective. The man was embarrassed. He thought Chu wanted to go on a date with him. Gu's cheeks turned red as he imagined walking with the dark-haired one. But the man could not afford it. He wasn't looking for love, at least now. The detective looked away from the dark-haired woman and said in a low tone that she was very beautiful, but he would not be able to walk with her. Chu was indignant. "This is not for a date. In fact, I have a fiancé." Gu annoyed her more and more by the second. How could he think of a date? Only one-night stands are paid in this way, to which Chu, of course, does not belong. The man sighed with relief, and this angered Chu even more. Would this detective really not want to go on a date with her? It was a blow to the self-esteem of the dark-haired woman. Chu is used to men dreaming about her. The woman squinted and with a strained smile asked the detective to calm down. She just wanted to make up for the damage he had done because of her. The dark-haired woman pointed to the broken watch on the man's wrist. Gu accidentally broke the thing while pulling the angry blonde away from Chu. The man told the dark-haired woman that she shouldn't worry about it. The watch is already old anyway. But the dark-haired woman was not going to back down from her intentions. It was a matter of principle for her to repay Gu, and not just to repay, but to show who she is. The dark-haired woman turned her back on the man, silently ordering him to follow her. The woman wanted to take the dark-haired man to her room. The man was somewhat confused by this. The dark-haired woman's desire to thank him caused Gu some suspicions. He suggested that maybe Chu really was a thief trying to mislead the detective, but the dark-haired man quickly dismissed those thoughts. "You have gone completely crazy with your work," he mentally chastised himself. "You are making up something incomprehensible. This woman must have a lot of money. Why should she steal?" A few minutes later, The detective and his new acquaintance were sitting at a table covered with various snacks. The waiter filled 2 glasses with wine. The dark-haired woman stood up to introduce herself to the detective. The woman with a slight smile on her lips informed the man that she was Chu Do-in, the director of the Iju brand, the granddaughter of the company's founder. The dark-haired man froze in place. Now he understood why the woman reacted so to his words about branded items. It's not nice to hear people disparage what you do for a living, isn't it? Chu smoothed her hair and took her seat. The woman was quite satisfied with the effect she had on the man. Now he will probably behave differently. After several minutes of silence, the dark-haired man said that he understood everything. He admitted that he did not expect such a turn of events. "I thought you were just some rich man's wife." The man scratched the back of his head. He always did that when he was nervous. Gu glanced at the food on the table. Black caviar, baked fresh chicken, seafood. All this probably costs a lot. The man asked Chu if she lavished herself like this every day. The dark-haired woman smiled and said that she arranges such banquets several times a month, but she also has the opportunity to buy such products every day. It seemed absurd to Gu to order a banquet hall for one person. He assumed that the dark-haired man was feeling lonely. The woman tensed. Where do these conclusions come from? Gu replied that it was unlikely that a person who had someone would invite a stranger to dinner. The dark-haired woman slammed her fist on the table. The man again misunderstood everything. Chu rather rudely replied that Gu should have listened to her more carefully. Half an hour ago, the dark-haired woman had already told him that she had a fiancé. It was for meeting him that she asked to prepare a luxurious banquet hall. But he couldn't come. Chu took a sip of wine. The dark-haired man was embarrassed again. He regretted that he had so lashed out at a woman who had decided to treat him to an expensive dinner. The man put a canapé with black caviar in his mouth. Gu had never eaten anything tastier than this. The dark-haired man with his mouth full told Chu that he was wrong about the fancy food. Perhaps this incredible taste is still worth several $1,000s. The man ate a few more small sandwiches and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He then turned his gaze to the dark-haired and smiled gently at her. Chu pretended not to care, but the blush on her cheek said otherwise. Or perhaps the woman blushed because of the wine. Who knows? It remains only to guess. There was silence in the hall for several minutes. Only the clinking of cutlery could be heard. Suddenly, the dark-haired man said softly, "I'm sorry for my words." The woman arched an eyebrow. The dark-haired man lowered his head and continued. He admitted that his statements about branded items were not entirely correct. When Gu said there was nothing special about Aiju's bags, he didn't mean it. It should be said that this happened to the detective quite often. He had a habit of speaking first, and then thinking. The man's eyes flashed. When he saw how the dark-haired woman organized the banquet, he immediately changed his opinion about sophistication and beauty. Maybe these two concepts really matter. The dark-haired woman opened her eyes wide. She hadn't expected him to be so attentive to detail. But if we take into account Gu's profession, then this is not surprising at all. The designer didn't care about it, or he simply took his beloved's efforts for granted. The dark-haired man was amused by the woman's surprise. He said that it looks like her lover doesn't appreciate her enough. If it weren't for that, he would do anything to be in this hotel today, Gu added. Chu looked away from the detective. It was unpleasant for her that a man she did not know said such things about her lover. This is impolite to say the least. However, the woman did not want to shout at Gu either. She was so nervous today. 15 minutes later, Gu and the dark-haired man finished their meal. The man stood up abruptly. He smiled at Chu and thanked her for the delicious lunch. The man was about to leave when the dark-haired woman grabbed his arm. "Mr. Gu Seyen." The woman's voice sounded quiet and uncertain. The surprised detective looked back at the headmistress. The woman said she did not fully repay him for his help. Saving a life is worth more than one lunch. The dark-haired woman glanced at the man's broken watch. Without letting Gu say a word, the woman quickly replaced the dark-haired man's old watch with a new one. Almost new. The detective was delighted. He himself wanted to change his old watch for a long time, but he still could not raise enough money. And here is such a gift. Gu looked at the thing on his wrist. The dark-haired woman watched the man with her arms crossed on her chest. The woman said that he should not worry about the price of the watch. Although it is better than Gu's previous watch, it is not new. It's still too expensive a gift. I don't think my help is worth that much. Despite Chu's words, the dark-haired man felt awkward. The woman smiled gently at him. She repeated that the watch was used and she had no use for it. So such a life-saving fee shouldn't bother Chu. The man thanked the dark-haired man. The director abruptly turned on her heels with her back to her husband and said goodbye to him. He thanked the woman once more and left the banquet hall. A few days later, a black car drove along the night highway. A somewhat frightened-looking blond young man was behind the wheel. He watched one of his passengers out of the corner of his eye, a man in a brown jacket. He was talking loudly on the phone with Gu. The man ordered the detective to wait for reinforcements to arrive and under no circumstances to act alone. Gu didn't answer. The man in the jacket sighed. He was already used to the unwarranted heroism of the dark-haired man, but this time the situation was very serious. One careless move and Gu could get hurt. Lee Yan-ah, a girl with short hair who sat behind the driver, advised the man in the jacket not to waste time on emotional talk and bad thoughts. It won't do anything anyway. Stubborn Gu will continue to act as he sees fit. The car driver agreed with his colleague. The man in the jacket ordered them to close their legs. Abandoned warehouse near the forest. This is where Gu was. A man peeked out from behind a large stone building. His face was tense. He carefully watched the criminals who made a deal in this place. There were 2 black cars on the road. From one of them, people in gray suits took out bound girls. They did not even try to resist because they were convinced that no one would come to their aid. After all, what are the chances of meeting at least one living soul at 3 o'clock in the morning near abandoned warehouses? A burly man with a square jaw said that all the girls were 17 years old. The customer's representative, a tall black-haired man in glasses, glanced at the goods and took out a suitcase with money from the car. "Here's $6,000, he said. The square-jawed man smiled contentedly and promised the black-haired man to bring the next batch of girls in a week. Gu frowned. He was worried that reinforcements had not yet arrived. The criminals are about to leave. The dark-haired man touched the white earpiece and whispered to his boss how soon they would be there. He shouted into the receiver so loudly that Gu winced. The boss told the detective that there were 10 minutes left to go to the warehouses. This did not suit Gu. During this time, these scum who sell girls will already leave here. The dark-haired man decided to act. He came out from behind the building and grabbed one of the men by the collar. He began to swear and fight back from the detective. Gu did not let the criminal go. Suddenly, the square-jawed man stabbed the dark-haired man from behind. 10 minutes later, reinforcements were finally in place. Boss Gu quickly got out of the car and ran towards the warehouses. The man screamed when he saw the unconscious detective on the ground. The boss fell to his knees in front of Gu and hugged his body to him. The man cried, chastising himself for not being able to convince Gu not to start the fight alone. The boss tried to bring the dark-haired man to his senses, and he succeeded. After a few minutes, the man opened his eyes. He rolled onto his stomach and took off his jacket and shirt to show his boss his wound. There was a small scar on Gu's back from the knife. The dark-haired man stood up and pointed his hand at the square-jawed man. "It was he who attacked me, but luckily the knife he used to strike me broke." The boss was impressed. How strong must the human body be so that a blow against it cannot withstand a knife? Gu smiled smugly. The man in the jacket noticed this and frowned. He sternly told the detective that he should have waited for reinforcements and not rushed bare-handed at the armed criminals. Chu blocked the boss. He pushed the detective. Gu calmed down and said that the boss should not worry. "Yes, I shouldn't have harmed the detainees, but I had no other choice. My actions are only self-defense." Gu put on his jacket. The boss sighed. There was no point arguing with Gu. The driver approached the dark-haired man. The blonde's attention was drawn to the watch on Gu's wrist. The driver began to look at the accessory. He nodded and lifted his colleague's hand to check something. The blonde opened his eyes wide and said that he didn't expect Gu to buy a Rolex. The driver asked why such a choice was justified. "Rolex?" asked the detective in surprise. He said he didn't know what kind of watch it was, but it was unlikely to be fake. The dark-haired man asked a colleague how much Rolexes cost. The blonde smiled. 500 million won! Gu froze in place. It turns out that the woman from the hotel deceived him when she said that this watch was not very expensive. But why did she do it? The dark-haired man wanted to understand everything. That is why after a few days he came to the hotel where Chu Do-ying was staying to talk to her. The man found the car of the director of Iju and began to wait for her to come. The dark-haired girl was surprised to see a detective near her car. Do you consider our country's detectives easy prey, Miss Chu? The man, he later admitted it himself, did not start the conversation very well. He again ignored the rule, think, speak. We already know about the performance that the detective put on after a few seconds, and about Chu's reaction to all this too. The woman was angry with the dark-haired man. After all, few people will like it when the person whom you fully repaid for your rescue accuses you of an unknown reason and spoils your reputation. The detective said that he should not have believed in the rotten insides of the dark-haired woman. The woman arched an eyebrow and smiled sinisterly. Rotten? Do I have? The man held out his hand with the watch. She was shaking with anger. Gu gritted out that he definitely shouldn't have accepted this watch, and Chu shouldn't have lied to the man about the price of this thing. The dark-haired woman smiled with the corners of her lips. She didn't think that Gu would guess so quickly that her words about the price of this watch were a lie. The woman mockingly told the detective that she did not expect this from him. He thought that Chu was alluding to his financial situation. The man exclaimed that he was not that poor. The headmistress turned her back on him and said that she didn't mean that at all. The puzzled dark-haired man asked what she was talking about then. The woman looked back at him. I thought you wouldn't guess how much this thing costs because you don't care about brands. The dark-haired woman offered to discuss everything else in her car. There is nothing to draw extra attention to, the man thought. He didn't know if he should trust Chu and get into her car. Suddenly, she will come up with something else. But when the woman said that the detective would have the next opportunity to meet her in 2 months, he quickly agreed. The dark-haired man got into the car and began to remove his watch from his wrist. The man simply could not accept such an expensive gift. Chu watched the dark-haired man silently. The man looked into the director's eyes, expecting to hear at least something from her. The woman looked at the road and sighed. Okay, give it back if you want it so much. True, in this case, Chu will have to throw this thing away. After all, the person for whom the woman bought the watch did not like it. The dark-haired man frowned. He understood that Chu was talking about his boyfriend. The dark-haired man felt sorry for the woman. She tried so hard to please her lover, but he did not appreciate it. Gu wanted to accept the watch so as not to offend Chu, but he really couldn't. His conscience simply did not allow him to receive such expensive things from strangers for nothing. The man put the watch in the glove compartment. The dark-haired ones asked Gu how he found her. Is someone from the police monitoring her personal life? If this is the case, then the dark-haired person may not worry about his reputation and safety. But why do detectives need it? Don't they have other things to do? The dark-haired man said that he had been watching Zivi Chu alone, and only in order to return her an unreasonably expensive gift. The dark-haired woman squinted. She couldn't believe that the detective was waiting for her outside the hotel where she was spending time with her boyfriend to hand over the watch for 500 million won. The man was startled. What? He did not know that Chu was not alone in the hotel. Gu blushed. He felt ashamed of his behavior. The dark-haired man began to make excuses and apologize. I just watched your movements around town. If I had known that you would be busy with personal matters, I would have met you at another time, said the man quickly. Gu narrowed his eyes and said that he has never been in a relationship, so he does not know how and when it is customary to go on a date. The dark-haired woman was shocked by this confession. She has not yet met such naive, innocent, and stupid men as the detective. The dark-haired girl silently stared at Gu, who was desperately avoiding eye contact with her. Then the woman did something that the man did not expect from her. She gently ran her hand over the dark-haired man's forehead. Chu looked into the detective's light brown eyes and smiled. Despite the fact that such men were not the type of director of Aiju, there was something about Gu that attracted her. After a few seconds, the dark-haired man, who had already recovered from the shock, asked what Chu was doing. The woman slowly took her hand away from the dark-haired man's face and said in a low tone, I have become interested in you, and it's very strange. Gu blushed even more. The man was so excited that it seemed he would soon forget how to breathe. Chu was amused by his reaction to everything that was happening. The dark-haired girl flashed her eyes playfully. The man frowned and said he was leaving. He also wished Chu a happy life with her boyfriend. That woman was not going to let go of someone who interested her so quickly. The dark-haired girl asked Gu to meet her. Otherwise, he will have to take the watch she gave him and suffer remorse. Chu noticed the frightened expression on the man's face and hastened to add that it wasn't for long. She will only hang out with him until she loses her love interest. As for her lover, the detective may not worry. Chu and Ham respect each other's private lives. Random affairs will not destroy their relationship. Gu quickly took his watch out of his glove compartment. The man decided that it is better to take this gift away than to enter into a short-term relationship with a woman who has a boyfriend. The dark-haired girl leaned into the steering wheel. "It's a shame you refused," the woman said in a low tone that the longer she looked at Gu, the more she wanted him. The man abruptly opened the car door and got out. He quickly left without even saying goodbye to Chu. The dark-haired woman sighed. On the one hand, she was sorry that she would not see this man again. But on the other hand, the woman did not want to destroy everything that she had created for years, for the sake of some feelings. A few hours later, Chu was home. The woman went to the entrance of the elite residential complex and went up to her floor. The dark-haired girl was surprised when she entered the hallway of her apartment and saw the inscription, "Thief," on the wall. The woman immediately called the police station. 15 minutes later, the investigators were already there. The dark-haired woman noticed Gu between them and cursed softly. Chu had already begun to believe in fate. How else can you explain a meeting with a man who promised not to bother her anymore? Gu himself was not very happy about the forced meeting with Chu. He asked with undisguised irritation in his voice what happened. The dark-haired woman replied that while she was away, someone had entered her apartment and left a note on the wall. Meanwhile, at the other end of the city, Ham was going to an elite restaurant. He was going to give his beloved a surprise. The man wrote a message to the dark-haired woman with an offer to have dinner together. But the woman did not answer. Ham waited 10 minutes, then ordered the driver to return to the office. The dark-haired man did not like to wait long for replies to his messages. In his opinion, Chu should have dropped all her affairs and written back to him immediately. The dark-haired man put the phone aside and picked up the tablet. "You missed your chance today, Chu Do-in," Ham whispered. If a woman had lunch with a designer today and proposed to him, he would agree. But only today. Ham smiled smugly. The man opened a site that had recently published an article about him and began reading the comments. Some admired the dark-haired man. Some wrote that his ideality aroused suspicion, as usual. But the man was most impressed by the comment about his orientation. Someone was sure that Ham was gay. The dark-haired man frowned. Wasn't Chu Doing the only one who thought so? New York a year ago. Ham, dressed in a light coat, walked through the snowy streets. The man hurried home. He wanted to drink hot tea and wrap himself in a warm blanket. Suddenly, someone called out to the dark-haired man, "Ham Jung-woo!" He looked around and saw a woman with brown hair, whose cheeks were red from the cold. The stranger held a bouquet of peonies in her hands. The woman identified herself as Chu Do-in, director of the Iju brand. She congratulated the dark-haired man on his Neiman Marcus award and handed him a bouquet. But the man did not take the flowers. He snorted and walked to the door of his house. "I don't feel like talking about work right now. I think I even turned down all the interviews." The dark-haired man was not at all offended by Ham's behavior. The woman is used to the fact that star personalities can be somewhat superficial. She invited her husband to meet. He froze in place. Chu took a step towards Ham. The woman whispered that she would support the dark-haired man and help him become the best designer in world history. Ham was confused, which was uncharacteristic of him. But who wouldn't be surprised by an offer to become a couple from a stranger? Before the man could say anything, the door of his house opened. A brown-eyed boy with light brown hair stood in the doorway. He was half naked with a white towel on his shoulders. The young man smiled at Ham. "Did you win the prize, my little one?" The designer did not answer anything, only gestured to Chu at the shopkeeper. The young man asked Ham who it was. The dark-haired woman clenched her jaw tightly. She tried to hide her disappointment. The dark-haired girl had no idea that Ham was gay. In this case, it will be impossible to become his girlfriend. The woman sighed. Her perfect plan was so senselessly destroyed. Meanwhile, Ham hissed at the boy. He asked what happened and received a light push from the dark-haired man. The boy finally understood what was required of him. He cleared his throat and turned to Chu. "I'm Ham Jong-woo's personal secretary." A smile shone on the dark-haired woman's face. The young man's words instilled hope in the dark-haired girl's heart, although she was not sure of their truth. It is likely that the young man lied so that the woman would not spread rumors about Ham. But even if it is so, Ham needs a woman with whom he could appear in public. Chu would play this role perfectly. The dark-haired man took the bouquet from the hands of the director of Iju and pressed it to himself. The man smiled at the woman with a charming smile and invited her to him. Our time. Chu's apartment. Gu photographed the writing on the wall. At the same time, the man asked the dark-haired man about other traces of the crime. The dark-haired woman replied that she did not notice anything else. But in general, it all looked very strange. Someone broke into the apartment of the CEO of a famous Korean brand, only to leave a message on the wall. Chu crossed her arms over her chest. While the detective was inspecting the premises, his colleagues were studying the identity of the victim. They scoured all social media to make sure they got to Chu Duin's apartment. The policemen could not even think that they would one day investigate a case in which a person of such magnitude would appear. The blonde man touched Chu's shoulder and told her that she needed protection. The girl with the black and purple plaid agreed with his words. She offered her help to the dark-haired. "I'm a girl, so I can stay and monitor your safety 24/7." But the dark-haired girl refused. Despite all the respect for police officers, she did not trust them very much. The woman turned her back to the puzzled blonde and his colleague. Chu said that government agencies often deceive people under the guise of nobility. The dark-haired girl looked at Gu, hinting at the incident with the watch. The woman smiled and asked in an ironic tone if he liked wearing the 500 million won watch that he so desperately refused. The dark-haired man frowned. Because of Chu, he was once again in an awkward position. Stuttering, he told the woman that he could not leave such an expensive thing at home. And suddenly it will be stolen? As Gu's experience with the police showed, criminals break into even well-secured homes. The dark-haired woman closed her eyes and smiled from the corner of her mouth. She liked to play detective. I liked to watch how he was embarrassed by her words. How in an instant he turned from a brave man into a little child who had done some harm. Gu's colleagues were amazed by his small talk with the director of Iju. The girl from the square took out the phone from her pocket and dialed the boss's number. The next morning, the boss, a blonde man and a girl with a brown hair, entered one of the offices of the police station. They all stared at Gu, who was calmly working on the computer. The dark-haired one asked the team what happened. He thought that he had done something wrong again, and now his colleagues would lecture him about this. But the man was wrong. The boss told Gu that he would become Chu's bodyguard. Chu's office. The dark-haired woman sat at her desk and thought about her tastes in things, drinks, and men. With the latter, everything was very ambiguous. Before, the dark-haired woman thought that her type was men who looked like Ham. They are just as impudent, proud, and selfish. But at the same time, they are smart enough not to say too much. However, the meeting with the detective destroyed Chu's idea of an ideal partner. The woman realized that naivety and sincerity attract her in men. The dark-haired woman raised a glass of whiskey to her lips. The woman had no weakness for alcohol, but sometimes she allowed herself to relax in this way. Gu entered the dark-haired woman's room. He looked around and said that this place reminded him of a museum. "There are so many beautiful things here." There was delight in the man's voice. Chu arched an eyebrow and wondered if Gu sometimes tried to seduce her. The dark-haired man recoiled. Chu could barely keep from bursting into laughter. Yes, the awkwardness of the detective, who catches dangerous criminals when communicating with women, really seemed funny to the dark-haired man. The woman decided to continue her game with the dark-haired man, and asked why then he would be her bodyguard. Gu looked away from Iju's headmistress and scratched the back of her head. He thought about what to answer to the dark-haired man, and in the end pretended that it was the boss's decision. But if Chu is stressed by Gu's presence, she can change the guard. "We drove by." The dark-haired woman cut him off in mid-sentence. The woman rested her chin on her fist and flashed her eyes. Chu said she asked the question to make sure Gu was not interested in her and would be able to do his job well. The man clenched his teeth in irritation. The detective was convinced that Chu was teasing him because he had never dated anyone. The dark-haired man wanted to say something scathing to the woman, but restrained himself. Still, he should behave like a professional and not react to provocations. The man told Chu firmly that everything would be fine. When the police finished investigating this case, the dark-haired man and Gu would not see each other again. The man took out a notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket to write down Chu's guess as to the identity of the criminal. The dark-haired girl leaned back in her soft, of course, designer chair and thought. She had many suspects. This is not the first time someone has tried to harm a woman. The only thing is that criminals were not so bold before. They smeared her in the press, spread rumors about her personal life, but never broke into the apartment. The dark-haired man froze in place. He was surprised that Chu hadn't called the police sooner. Does she really care about her life? A very strange position for the heiress of a huge company. The man asked Chu who of her enemies hated her the most. The dark-haired woman took a sip of whiskey. I don't know, Gu thought. Yes, it's not easy. Suddenly, the detective remembered a recent incident at the hotel, during which he met the director of Iju. The man shouted that the crazy blonde could have left the message. Chu asked what the man was talking about. The dark-haired man explained that he was talking about a woman who accused the director of Ija of stealing a bag. She was still pulling your hair. Gu frowned. He hated to mention it. He felt resentment for Chu who had been wronged. The dark-haired girl said that his assumption seemed perfectly logical to her. The woman reached out to the man's face and touched his cheek with her fingers. Gu shook his head, pretending to dislike the dark-haired woman's touch. Chu smiled and took her hand away. The woman asked the detective to take care of her. The dark-haired would not want to die before she inherits the Iju Empire. Gu, who did not understand the joke, simply said that he would protect Chu. He held out his hand for a handshake to seal the beginning of their partnership. Chu blushed and said with undisguised annoyance in her voice that it was like temptation. What? Gu lowered his head. The dark hair said she likes men with big hands. The detective's palms were so warm and strong. Chu could barely resist kissing him. Gu abruptly let go of the dark-haired woman's hand and exclaimed that he did not want to know the woman's type at all. He is not here for her to satisfy her sexual needs. The man clenched his hand into a fist, trying to look confident. Focus on the investigation. He handed the woman a piece of paper to make a list of suspects. The dark-haired girl let out a soft laugh and stood up. The woman said she would do it a little later. She has an important meeting in 20 minutes. Gu tried to say something to Chu, but she glared at him in such a way that he immediately fell silent. The woman approached the detective and suggested that he himself check the people from her company. Who knows? Maybe an enemy of the director of Iju is hiding among them. The dark-haired woman stood on her tiptoes and whispered in the dark-haired woman's ear that she would find it difficult to focus on the investigation. After all, when your love interest is by your side, it's hard to think about anything else. The cheeks of the dark-haired man once again blushed during the day. Chu turned her back to the detective. She took incredible pleasure in mocking him. Let him know when to appear in someone else's life at an inconvenient moment. The dark-haired man narrowed his eyes. "Don't catch me," he spat. After a few seconds, he apologized for his rudeness caused by the excitement of the investigation. Gu had never done this kind of task before and was afraid of doing something wrong. The dark-haired woman lowered her head. While the detective worried about the investigation, she worried about unrequited love. 5 minutes later, the dark-haired woman and the man were already in the company's office. They entered the elevator. Gu asked the dark-haired man if his sudden appearance would surprise anyone. The woman said with confidence in her voice that everything would be fine. There is nothing surprising in the fact that she is accompanied by a personal bodyguard. All workers know about the large number of enemies of the director. The dark-haired woman had been meaning to hire security for a long time now, as even this executive-only elevator had been terror attempted. The man was shocked. Terror? In the elevator of the office of a popular company, which must be guarded by professionals. The dark-haired woman replied that there is nothing strange here. Kim didn't hire good bodyguards. She considered it a waste of money. In her opinion, the lives of the workers were worth nothing. All of them could be replaced. These words led Gu to believe that the CEO might have threatened Chu. The woman said she was unsure about that. Although the general director has a nasty character, she would hardly stoop to the point of trying to kill her own granddaughter. But you're right. The dark-haired woman looked back at the detective and flashed her eyes. I should be careful. The heiress to a fashion empire has a high probability of dying from an accident. In Korea, everyone knows about it. Mysterious deaths of famous people were not unusual here. Some rock star will get into a car accident, some TV presenter will be found in a pool of blood. Envious scoundrels always remove talent from their path, hoping that it will help them get the fame they dream of. Gu froze in place. He had heard of celebrity cases but thought they were just rumors. Such hype from the mass media. As the couple exited the elevator, Chu pointed to the glass doors ahead. There are many people in this company who would like to take the position of a dark-haired woman. Maybe Gu will be able to recognize them. He should be careful. The dark-haired man and the man entered the office. The workers greeted the director and were about to return to work as Gu noticed. The man caught dozens of interested looks, and he didn't like it. Gu hated excessive attention to his person. The man took out a phone from his pocket. Gu wrote to the boss that he would not be able to work as Chu Do-ying's bodyguard. The dark-haired man asked to give him some other errand, but the boss did not answer. The detective put his hand to his forehead and sighed in exasperation. It turns out that he will have to follow Chu all day today and be the laughingstock of the company's workers. Such a prospect, but Gu had no choice. A blonde woman approached the director. She told Chu that the staff had prepared everything for the interview. Chu whispered to the dark-haired girl that the blonde's name was Cha San-a. She was the first team leader in the Iju management department. The dark-haired woman stepped forward and told Gu to move faster. She hates her wards. They are as good as a goat's milk. Gu hurried to catch up with the woman. How he wanted to say a few kind words to her, but you can't. Professionalism above all else, the man reminded himself. Cha asked Chu with a mocking smile who her companion was. The dark-haired woman replied that this man, who was behaving somewhat strangely, was her bodyguard. He will be next to the woman for 24 hours. This way, the director of Iju will feel safe. Cha said that hiring security is a good decision. Only the guard himself is not very good. He attracts too much attention. The blonde told Chu that she could find someone more experienced for her, but the dark-haired woman refused. The women and Chu entered another office. 3 men in shirts and beige jumpers were already waiting for them there. "We are glad to see you, Director." The dark-haired woman wanted to say hello to them, but she didn't have time. Gu rushed forward and began to beat the men. He punched one in the stomach, pressed the second to the floor with his foot, and squeezed the third's throat with his hand. The detective looked at the headmistress and asked if she was okay. The puzzled woman replied that she was fine, but her workers do not seem to be normal. Gu opened his eyes wide. Workers? The man did not even suspect that he attacked the heads of the marketing and production development departments. Gu let the men go. He began apologizing for his behavior. The head of the marketing department asked the dark-haired man who he was. The man replied that he was the headmistress's bodyguard. The dark-haired girl crossed her arms over her chest and smiled. She told Cha that Gu would make a good bodyguard. Let him be inexperienced and a little nervous, but capable. Not everyone can scatter 3 men. Chu asked the blonde not to disturb him unnecessarily. Cha asked the dark-haired woman what she was talking about. The woman leaned over to her colleague and whispered to her to stop, unintentionally framing her people. Chu wanted to keep those she really needed with her. Cha tried to squeeze out a friendly smile, but it came out so-so. The 2 men told the director that they were her people. The head of the marketing department rubbed his throat, which ached from the detective's firm grip. The black-haired man explained in a sad tone that he just wanted to discuss something with the headmistress, and her bodyguard treated him so rudely. Maybe Chu should tell Gu who can't be touched. The head of the sales department chose another way to gain the detective's trust. He patted Gu on the shoulder. So he tried to look friendly. Oh, and something else. The black-haired asked the detective to protect the headmistress. Gu flashed his eyes and smiled. Of course. He bit the hypocrisy of the workers but did not show it. Now is not the time to clash with anyone who gets in the way. Chu sat down at her desk and said that the interview could begin. The woman asked the head of the marketing department to invite the first candidate. Gu left the office. He did not want to delve so deeply into his work. In addition, his presence can scare candidates. The man entered the toilet cubicle and took the phone out of his pocket. He was going to write to his boss about the incident with the company's workers. Little did Gu know that his supervisor was in the next cubicle. The man got a job as a cleaner undercover. He told Gu that he had nothing to worry about. Excessive suspicion, on the contrary, will come in handy in this case. The boss recommended that the detective look closely at other employees of the company. An hour has passed. The final stage of the interview for the Iju design team took place. One by one, disappointed people ran out of Chu's office. Those sitting in line whispered excitedly among themselves. They tried to imagine what was required of dark-haired candidates. And why hasn't a single person left her office at least calm? Gu went to the door and listened. He heard Chu's disgruntled voice. Why am I the only one with eyes? The woman was annoyed that none of the candidates met her requirements for employees. Their work looked good but banal, and the dark-haired needed new ideas. The heads of departments also looked tense. True, not because of the candidates, but because of Chu's behavior. After a few minutes, the dark-haired woman announced a break. The director felt that if she did not cool down now, there would be nothing left of this office. The department heads left the premises. In the corridor, they collided with the cleaner. He apologized to the workers for his clumsiness and returned to work. As the department heads passed the man, he looked back. A detective entered Chu's office. The dark-haired woman crossed her arms over her chest and asked the man if he had any guesses about the suspects. The man remained silent. So far, he has not understood anything. The woman asked in a displeased tone, had Gu even started his work? The dark-haired man snorted and said that his work had started since the start of the operation. In addition, Gu is not a ward of the dark-haired woman, so she should watch her manner of speech. Finally, the man dared to express his dissatisfaction with the woman's behavior. He sat down on the couch. Gu expected that now the director of Iju would start yelling at him like she yelled at the failed applicants. But surprisingly, she didn't. The dark-haired girl only asked if her words really sounded rude. The detective looked away from her and said that it was. The dark-haired girl rested her chin on her hand and twinkled her eyes charmingly. So you liked it better if I pretended to be a pay girl? The dark-haired man crossed his arms over his chest and furrowed his brows. He didn't mean that at all. Gu only wanted to say that you should treat people politely and at least sometimes think about their feelings. Chu smiled. Her assumptions about the taste of dark hair in women turned out to be correct. The type of detective is the complete opposite of the director of Iju. He likes girls who look like heroines of manhwa about unearthly love. The only problem is that there are almost no such characters left. Chu told the man that he should think about it. He wondered what exactly. The dark-haired woman did not have time to answer. Cha's voice was heard from behind the office door. Bilyavka reminded that it was necessary to continue the interview. In addition, a special candidate appeared. More precisely, a candidate. The general director of Iju ordered a word for her. The head of marketing said that Kim ordered the dark-haired woman to hire this woman as a designer. The dark-haired woman stood up sharply. Ordered? She couldn't stand it when the CEO lectured her and meddled in her business. The woman asked who this candidate was. The marketing manager said her name is Chu Seo-ying. The director of Iju froze in place. Is this candidate her cousin? Is it just a coincidence? There are many people with the same first and last names. The dark-haired woman stepped into the corridor and saw a light-haired woman sitting on one of the chairs, dressed in simple black pants and a baggy turquoise tunic. The candidate held a folder with her works in her hands. Chu Do-ying bit her lip. All her hopes were shattered. There was no coincidence. Sitting in front of the dark-haired woman was the favorite granddaughter of the CEO, Holy Innocence Chu Seo-yin, the person who, according to others, should have taken the place of the dark-haired woman. By the way, as the director of Iju noticed, Chu Seo-ying was the type of detective Gu, and this made Chu Do-ying even more angry. The dark-haired man came out of the headmistress's office to see what was going on, and let out a surprised cry when he saw Chu Seo-ying. The blonde opened her eyes wide. Is that you? My neighbor from the 301st apartment? The man asked the blonde what she was doing here. The dark-haired woman glared at Gu. So it turns out these two are acquaintances. Just wonderful, the woman said in her mind. Once again, what she liked would go to her sister. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria near the office, the heads of the management, marketing, and promotion departments were sitting at one of the tables. They were talking about Chu Seo-ying. Cha said that this woman once cut off all ties with her family. I wonder why she appeared in the company. The marketing manager whispered that he had heard that the CEO allegedly wanted to make Chu Seo-in her heir, not Chu Do-in. Kim loved her second granddaughter more. She considered her more talented than the dark-haired one. When the blonde studied at the university, all the teachers admired her work. They said that Chu So-in has every chance to become a famous designer. However, the blonde never thought about these words. She did not want to connect her life with the fashion industry. The woman was more interested in working with children. She dreamed of working in a kindergarten. But Grandma Kim insisted that Chu Seo-in still finish her studies as a designer. The general director hoped that one day the blonde would lose interest in small snot and want to do what she was good at. In that case, Kim would leave the company to her. Chu Do-in's office. The woman was sitting at her desk with Gu standing behind her with the most serious expression on his face. The dark-haired girl asked her sister if it was true that she was the detective's neighbor. The blonde ignored her question and turned to Gu. I was surprised to see you here. You get injured a lot, so I guessed you had a dangerous job. It turns out that you are a security guard. After a few seconds, the blonde added that Gu was very handsome. The dark-haired man's eyes widened at such a compliment. Chu Do-ying, on the other hand, sat still and stared at her sister with an icy gaze. Of course, the dark-haired girl didn't like that the blonde was encroaching on her love interest. When Gu was about to thank Chu Xiaoying for her kind words, the director of Iju snapped at him. The man had to shut up. Chu Do-ying reminded him that it was an interview in the office, not a friendly meeting. The woman continued her conversation with her sister. The director of Iju asked why the blonde decided to work here. After all, she was never interested in the company. The blonde smiled slyly and replied that her interests were changing. Before, she really wasn't attracted to the prospect of sketching bags. But now everything has changed. The blonde crossed her arms over her chest and said that their tastes were not very different. At the same time, she cast an ambiguous look at the detective. The dark-haired man squinted. He sensed the hostility and mockery in Chu Xiaoying's voice. Maybe she's not as cute as she seems at first glance. The director of Iju blushed and asked Gu to leave the office. The dark-haired man got out and headed to the restroom to talk to the boss. He was already waiting for the man at the door. The detective told him about everything that happened between the two sisters. He suggested that Chu Xiaoying could be the dark-haired woman's rival. Apparently, they both want to get this company. The boss asked if Gu was interested in the woman. The dark-haired man began to get angry. Like, how could he be interested in someone so cold and rude? Cold and rude? Asked the boss. I thought your neighbor was just a little girl. Gu felt embarrassed. He thought of Chu Do-ying, not her sister. The boss told the man that Chu So-in was the perfect match for him. The dark-haired man thought, maybe the boss was right. The dark-haired sister really fits his type. Sweet, kind, and affectionate. She always treated people very politely. And Gu liked it. But her conversation with Chu Do-ying made the man somewhat confused. It seemed that the blonde did not hide her dislike for her sister. The dark-haired man told the boss that Chu Xiaoying should be put on the suspect list. Meanwhile, in the dark-haired woman's office, Chu Do-ying told her sister about working at the company. It will not be easy to hold on to the workplace due to connections. Even if we are talking about the position of a designer, the Iju Empire is not a place where you can come to work just out of interest. The blonde said that she understands everything and is very sorry that she took away such a valuable place from talented people. However, she has a knack for sketching. The blonde crossed her legs and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I would even say talent. No matter how hard you try to prove otherwise, it's true. The dark-haired girl pursed her lips. She did not think that her sister had turned from a modest little girl into a viper. But Chu Do-ying knew how to deal with such. The woman stood up and approached the blonde. The dark-haired girl smiled mockingly at her sister and took her chin. The director of Iju whispered to the blonde that her life would change from this day on. I carefully monitor the work of my wards and do not make concessions to anyone, added the dark-haired woman. The blonde just flashed her eyes. She was not at all frightened by her sister's words. Chu So-in was convinced that the dark-haired man would not dare to harm a person whose patron is CEO Kim. The blonde pushed Chu Do-ying's hand away from her face. A few hours later, the dark-haired woman's working day ended. Today, she felt more tired than ever. Coming to the company of Chu So-yin became another challenge for the director. Now she will have to think how to get rid of her competitor. The dark-haired woman was going to do this on the way home. She was just walking to her car. Suddenly, Chu Do-ying called out to Gu. The man was indignant that the dark-haired woman left the office without warning him. The detective reminded the woman that it is now dangerous for her to move without an escort. Don't you agree with that? He looked into her eyes. The dark-haired woman froze in place for a moment. Gu's gaze mesmerized her. The woman was finally convinced that she had fallen in love with the detective. However, it was so untimely. Gu's soft cackle snapped the dark-haired man out of his thoughts. The director of Iju told her husband that they would go together. The dark-haired man silently got into the car and fastened his seatbelt. Chu Do-ying started the car and informed her husband that he would be driving on the way back. The dark-haired man did not understand what she was talking about. What is the way back? Aren't they going to Chu Do-in's house? The woman said she was going to drink a few glasses of wine at her boyfriend's apartment. Will you wait in the car or stand by and watch? Chu flashed her eyes. The dark-haired man blushed when the meaning of the woman's words reached him. He squeezed the seatbelt with his hands and began to say that he would not in any way interfere in the private life of the dark-haired woman, especially when it comes to such intimate things. The woman arched an eyebrow and asked the detective what he imagined. He and Ham will just drink some wine so that the work discussion won't be so boring. The man realized that he had babbled too much. He didn't know how not to burn with shame. The dark-haired man turned his head towards the window and exclaimed with indignation in his voice that he could not invent anything. And it was true. In the police station, the dark-haired man was known as a person who has a complete lack of imagination. Gu always behaved too rationally, which is why he was nicknamed Artificial Intelligence. The dark-haired girl stared at the detective like he was a fool. She, of course, already knew that in stressful situations the man speaks all kinds of nonsense. But this time he outdid himself. The woman imagined how policemen walk around the station and call artificial intelligence. The dark-haired woman couldn't hold back and laughed. Yes, the woman had a rough day today. But Gu managed to lift her spirits a little. After a few minutes, Chu Doying calmed down and looked at the tomato-red Gu. The woman suggested that his brain was now being rebooted. The man looked so strange at that moment. The dark-haired man began to make excuses. It's just hot outside. Chu raised her fist to her lips and let out a small laugh. Of course, she did not believe the detective's words. What kind of heat can we talk about if it's winter outside? The dark-haired man decided to change the subject. He asked the dark-haired woman why she behaved so calmly. After all, thieves broke into her house. Are the heirs of the Aiju Empire not afraid of anything? The man asked. The director immediately became serious. She told the dark-haired man that it was. There is no point in being afraid. All the same, she has no one to turn to for help, so she can only smile and pretend that everything is fine. The dark-haired girl rested her head on her hand. Gu froze in place with wide eyes. He thought about the dark-haired woman's words. If you think about it, she really has no one to turn to. Her parents are dead. Her grandmother doesn't like her. Her cousin wants to compete for the rights to the company. Even Ham never once supported the dark-haired girl when she was having a hard time. The detective felt really sorry for this woman. Now he understood why she was rude to others. It was her only way to survive in a world where every other person wanted to kill her.